If people could see these three cultures, which are Abrahamic cultures, Abraham was a tree, and these three cultures branched from the tree. If they could see that we came from this common ground, maybe there would be less anger and rage and distrust. The point wasn't to assimilate. It wasn't to create the melting pot for everybody to jump into and become all the same. That isn't what this is about. This is really a project of non-assimilation. It's a project of celebrating the differences of the peoples, which is beautiful in itself.
The Illustrated Daily. Managing Editor Hal Rhodes.
It is called The Tent of Meeting, and it will be on display at the Museum of Fine Arts in Santa Fe through January the 19th. A remarkable collage of images depicting the world's three major monotheistic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And what you see above me here is a reproduction of an image of the prophet Abraham, whose influence leads directly to the spiritual beliefs of each of those religions. Created by collage artist Michel Zakheim, it is appropriate at this special season that we should savor this beautiful and graceful statement of hope, what Zakheim calls a shelter for ideas in search of harmony in a world of diversity. The process of its creation is every bit as fascinating as its images are moving.
That was done on paper, collaged on paper, with images from all over the world in terms of illuminated manuscripts, Bibles, old books, anything I could find that was at least 100 years old or more. If I was going to do an Abraham story, I'd go to the file and I'd take out all of the pictures I had of Abraham, and I'd start putting things together to tell the story in a way that I wanted to tell it, using maybe 10 to 15 different sources for each narrative. It had to be blown up. It was a third this size when I worked on it. It was put through a Xerox 2080 machine, which is a machine used for engineering purposes. And we blew it up first at 141% onto paper, and then again 141% onto paper, and then retouched that, so then that became the art. And then we blew that up onto canvas. And then it was sewn first, and then it was painted.
At a special Carmelite ceremony upon its opening at the museum, the Tent of Meeting was blessed by representatives of each of the three faiths embraced within its walls.
Shalom. We welcome all the peoples of all the earth into our tent, and we make a great prayer for peace, that all peoples will come to the tent of the world in peace. Yevarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, Yehi Adonai panav elecha v'yichunecha, Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yisim lachem shalom.
תודות לאלוהים,
Thanks to
אלוהים
God,
של העולם,
God of the world.
והוא הרחמן הרחום,
He is the compassionate and forgiving one.
הוא המלך של העולם והיום הדין.
He is the king of the world and of judgment day.
שאנחנו מאמינים בו, והוא מה שנותן לנו את האוכל שלנו,
And shows us the straight path to peace and shows a straight path for those who err.
והשלום לכולנו.
And peace to us all.
May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with each one of you. And also with you. We shall go up with joy to the house of our God. We shall go up with joy to the house of our God. I rejoiced when I heard them say, let us go to God's house. And now our feet are standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. We shall go up with joy to the house of our God.
The feeling in the tent while the program was going on was quite extraordinary, and it kept building all day. It was as if it couldn't have been any other way. It had to be with Mother Tessa and the Carmelites here. And I felt that of all the blessings that we've had, and this is the fourth installation, that it was really the most beautiful and meaningful.
Why a tent?
To me, I needed to create a space, a shelter, an environmental piece, and conceptual piece, whatever you want to call it, that people could come into and contemplate various subjects and notions and ideas that I presented. And it seemed to me that it had to be a structure. I couldn't do it flat on the wall and on canvas any longer. And since I'd done Xerox before on canvas, but much smaller, I had the idea of doing a tent, but I didn't have a notion for it. And it wasn't until I made the trip to Sinai that the notion came, and then I had a reason to make a tent.
I was going to ask you about the inspiration for this whole project. It has to do, I know, with the Sinai.
Yes, it does.
Tell me about it.
Well, the story was that I had gone to Israel and not been able to go to the Sinai because it had just been returned to Egypt, and it just was very difficult to cross the borders. So, and I had gone back to London and was visiting a friend, and as a result of that visit, I did a favor for somebody who had done a book on the Sinai. And when I spoke to him on the telephone from London, he said, well, have you ever been? And I said, no. And he said, well, I'll let you know when I'm going. I'll take you, and thanks for doing this favor for me. And I thought, oh, sure, right? So I came home, and this was in August that I came home. In November, he called from Israel, and he said, I'm leaving in 3 weeks. Can you be ready to go? And I have a family, and I had to go all through all this stuff. Can I do it? Can I? Right? But we decided I could go, and I did. And so I met him. I didn't know him. I just had talked to him on the telephone. And he took me in. He had been the director of the Nature Reserve at Santa Catarina when the Israelis had the Sinai Peninsula. And so not only is he Israeli, but he speaks very fluent English and Arabic. And his area is folklore. So he arranged for me to trek in the mountains of the Sinai for 3 weeks with himself and a couple of Bedouin, one of which is a man named Mahmoud, who is a specialist in the folklore of his tribe. So that's how I got to the Sinai. And then what I realized from traveling with Arabs, my being Jewish, was that it was my fear of the unknown, my unknowledge of the Arab community and their tradition that created in me the fear. So I decided that I was going to try to deal with that. And after living with many different Arabs over those 3 weeks, I found that for some magical reason that the psyche has when it decides it's ready, I lost the fear I had of the Arab community. And at that point, I realized I wanted to do the tent.
You were telling me earlier something I found fascinating, that as a consequence of this experience, and working on this project, you have a deeper but more private religious sense than heretofore had been the case. Could you explain that?
Yes, well, I come from a secular family. There was no religion, but I was always very interested in religion, and I went to the Catholic Church and the Baptist Church and the Mormon Church when I was a little girl. And as I got into my 40s, I started becoming extremely interested in my own religion of Judaism and started to study it. But I found as I travel and as I read that I don't feel particularly comfortable in a congregation. Because of the studying of the different religions, what I'm beginning to find is a way of praying myself that is my own, and as a result, though, of what I've learned from the other religions of the world.
That's fascinating. The pole, other than
Yes.
holding up a very substantial amount of canvas,
Yes.
and I suspect rather heavy canvas, does it have any special
Oh,
significance?
yes. Yes. The pole was designed and built by the Lindisfarne Association in Colorado. Keith Critchlow, who is a special person, who is a sacred geometrist and a sacred architect, helped design it. And it's based with the four sides being on the ground, being the human body being grounded, and it moves up from the 4 to 8 to 16 to 32 to the 3 rings at the top of the 3 traditions and then out into the sky. So it's very, very symbolic as the center pole for the tent.
So it's truly a metaphor for all that's taking place here.
Absolutely. Everything is except the lights, for instance.
All right, let's talk about the 3 religions symbolized by those 3 rings and embraced within these walls, starting with Judaism. Why the wings?
The wings were a wonderful mistake. The hardest part of doing the art here for me was creating the architecture of each wall to put the narratives within. That was very difficult for me. The narratives were easy.
What do you mean, create the architecture?
Well, it needed, like in this case, the wings. In the case of Christianity, the trees. In the case of Islam, the openings for the tubas. To find a way to place the narratives was very hard. So I had the idea of the wings because I wanted people, when they walked into the tent, to not feel like they were being pushed down by the ceiling, but I wanted it to feel open. So I went to the wings and later on found that the wings are a metaphor that in Jewish folklore, which is called midrash, the wings carry on the oral tradition. They carry it on so we don't lose it. So inadvertently, and part of the magic of all this tent to me has been learning these things. And that's why the wings were used.
Michelle, how many images are there here on the Jewish wall? And out of the rich Jewish tradition, how did you happen to select the ones we see here?
Well, I'm not sure exactly the count. I think it's around 100. What I did is I read, of course, the Old Testament a few times, and a lot of folklore.
How many times?
Oh, I don't have any idea. I don't know. Probably 10 or 11 times just to do this particular one, besides the times I read it before, of course. But I looked for a balance of stories. I wanted to deal with feminist issues in Judaism. I wanted to deal with the notions of mirror images of peoples, that you hear one story or read one story in the Bible and yet you can interpret it another way. So I would look for another story that would balance that. I also wanted to create stories that people could recognize without their guide, which they used to come in, such as Genesis and Adam and Eve and the Tower of Babel and Noah's Ark. So there's some in here that are very recognizable. But I wanted to tell the story of the Sabbath, and I have that here. And so what I did is I used the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which is the Torah, and I did the Jewish wall that way.
Have you a favorite amongst them all?
Yes, I do.
Would you share it with us?
Yes. My favorite one is right over there, which is Miriam. And the story of Miriam, I think, is very beautiful in that when they were fleeing and the Red Sea opened and they moved through the Red Sea and the sea closed, the story is that Miriam danced with joy with a tambourine. Well, there's a midrash story is that she danced with joy but also with great terror and horror at all of the dead people that were left behind, that drowned in the waters. So the image that I did of her has her dancing but also has great tears coming out of her eyes. So I liked doing that kind of imagery. I also like the whimsy parts where Abraham, for instance, with the 7 kisses. And with that, Abraham, when he died, Isaac placed 7 kisses on his forehead. And he said to God, though, before his soul departed, he said, you know, I don't know if I'm quite ready to go yet. So God said, well, okay, I'll tell you what, I'm going to put you in a chariot, and I'm going to take you to show you the other side of the world. So he did. He put Abraham in a chariot, and he took him and he showed him the other side of the world. And Abraham saw what immortality looked like, and he decided he didn't want anything to do with it whatsoever and chose to be mortal. And we think is buried in Hebron.
There must be, there are countless images of Moses available to
Yes.
someone. How did you select this one?
Well, Moses is a wonderful question for you to ask, because Moses is always depicted with horns. And that's become a very anti-Semitic notion, visual notion. The word horn and the word ray are very similar in Hebrew. And supposedly when Michelangelo was painting Moses, he misinterpreted the 2 words and placed horns on his head. So what I did, being Jewish and having had, when I was a little girl, somebody come to the door and ask to feel my horns, I decided that I was going to not only dispel this notion, but I was going to dispel it for myself. So I just took all of the images of Moses that I had, and I cut all the horns off. And what I've done is, wherever Moses is depicted, I have rays instead of horns.
Did somebody really come to your door and ask to feel your horn?
Oh, yes. I promise. It was quite shocking, and at that time I really didn't know what they were talking about.
I bet. Let's go to the Wall of Islam, if you don't mind.
Okay.
There are no human images on this Wall of Islam. Why is that?
Well, in Islam, there is a law can create people or animals. It's very similar to Judaism, where there's a tenet against making graven images, and it's the same in Islam. Some artists do get around it a bit. For instance, in the 15th century, with the Persian miniatures, Muhammad and all of the prophets were visualized, but that was for a very short time. Later, they did these zoomorphic images. If you see on the wall, there's a bird and there's a lion, and everybody says, but look, there's an animal. But if you look closely, it's calligraphy. And the calligraphy tells a prayer. In this case, it's the Bishmillah. And that's how they're able to also do an image of an animal, by using it as a prayer.
Well, that indeed is calligraphy.
That's right. The whole animal is composed. It's called zoomorphic.
Well, what are some of the images we're seeing here?
Well, this of course is very interesting to me, Islam, because it was so difficult in trying to tell the stories from the Quran in an abstract way. What I did is I created a system here that I felt could hold the images, and that's that grill work in the background is very typical in Islamic countries. You see it over windows and so on. And then I took, there's 114 surahs in the Quran. A surah is like a chapter. Right. But in the Quran, it doesn't start chronologically from the beginning of time to the end. It starts with the longest surah first, except for the very first one, which is a Bishmillah. So what I did is I wanted to create a feeling of infinity, because that is really a real feeling I have about Islam. So up at the top of these openings here are 3 images. The one on the upper left with the blue square is called the Bishmillah. It's a prayer that's similar to our God, our Lord, or the Shema that is said in Judaism. The one at the very top is for a symbol for Allah, a calligraphy symbol for Allah, and the one to the right is for Muhammad. And if you look carefully, you see the black there? It's flames. So wherever Muhammad is mentioned on the walls here in Islam, that is reproduced, so that that's his symbol. Then what I've done is these big pieces that are coming up here are called tubas that form this opening. The tubas, which create this form here, are a wonderful story that the name comes. It's a tree of life, it means. And the story is that when Mary and Joseph and Jesus were fleeing from Herod, when the Herod was killing the babies under 2 years old. Now this is in the Quran, remember, it's not in the New Testament, the story. They fled to Egypt and they were starving and they went under a tree and the tree fed them fruits and vegetables, and that tree is called a tuba. So it's a reflection also of the tree of life that we use on the Christian wall. Now there's 5 openings between these tubas throughout the wall here, and each of these openings denotes a time of day of prayer. Muslims pray 5 times a day, so it's symbolic for that. There are, besides images for the surahs, there's also some Arabic poetry that I've imaged also, which is very beautiful. And the last one, in fact, on the Islamic wall, talks about the tabernacle of Islam. And that's how I end it.
The Islamic stories are actually translated from Judaism.
Well, the Islamic stories come from many...
They have roots in Judaism.
Oh, they have roots in Judaism and Christianity. You see, Muhammad, Muhammad was in the 7th century, so he was after Jesus and he was after Abraham, of course, and Moses. He would go and he would sit and he'd put this great cover over him and go into a trance, and he would then verbalize in this trance stories that were coming to him. And his scribe would write them down. And of course, he already had this collective unconscious of these stories. He had heard the stories. They were part of his... yes. And so that's why they came through again. The story of Ishmael and Hagar and Abraham, of course, is very central in Islam, whereas in Judaism, it's Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac. But it's the same, it comes from the same source. It comes from Abraham.
Takes us back to the beginning. May we go over and look at the Christian wall?
Okay.
The flight of Mary and Joseph that you were telling me about.
The flight of right here in the center.
Yeah, I see, yes. The Nativity, very appropriate this time of year. Perhaps we should just tell the story.
Okay. This tree deals with the whole birth of Jesus, starting with the Annunciation at the top, and right under that, the Visitation. You see Mary and Elizabeth. To the left is the marriage of Joseph and Mary. To the right is the birth of Jesus. And right below the Visitation is the journey into Egypt by Joseph and Mary and Jesus after his birth, which is the same story as in the Quran on the other wall that is told in the Quran, of course, and the same here. Some of the parables are here. There he is with the healing of the man with leprosy. And here he's being baptized by John the Baptist. That's the marriage of Cana is right there under the huppah, which of course was a Jewish marriage because it was a Jewish community. Up in there, let's see, there's the beheading of John the Baptist's father, who was also beheaded by Herod. Which,
that family had some
some problems. And Herod was an interesting, difficult person. So that this entire tree, which is a tree of Jesse, there's Jesse lying in the tree there. And the Jesse is from the family of David. And the tree of Jesse is, of course, a family tree showing the history of the family. And this is what Jesus came from. He came from the family of David. So there again is the correlation to Judaism, of Jesus being a Jew and, of course, later a rabbi.
The Last Supper. No,
the Last Supper is on this last tree over here, which deals with his passion. And the Last Supper is interesting to me because it not only was the Last Supper, it was Passover, and it was also the time when the Eucharist was formed. And the hand there holding the wafer, it stands for that. It also is a time when I'm showing the tent to people, I'm able to talk about the fact that Jesus was a Jew and a rabbi, and that being a central motif.
Do you wonder, I certainly do, if people understood better the history and the origins of these great religions, what their attitudes would be, how it would affect their thinking
Gee, it
about
may just dispel all sorts of things, wouldn't it?
You'd think it would, wouldn't
Yes,
you?
you would. I think that in this country it surprises me how few people know the history of Christianity, actually, that they know that the prophets were Jewish and Jesus was Jewish and Mary was Jewish and Joseph was Jewish. And it's sometimes I have to show people the calendar to prove it to them. So doing this project is one way for me to try to educate people, and I feel as soon as they're educated, of course, they don't have the same anxieties.
When they come into this tent, your impression, does it achieve the objective you hoped it would?
Oh, that's a big question.
Yes, it is.
I hope it touches a few people. That's all I can hope to do. I mainly am interested in children coming in and being told these stories, because I think that's where a lot of bigotry begins, when children are told by their parents, or from other people on the block, so that if it can be dispelled when they're young, it becomes part of who they are. I'm just trying. I don't know how much success I'll have. I know that we did have somebody come in at the beginning who was a born-again Christian and didn't like what I had done at all. And then we talked, and I explained what I was doing, and I showed them, and we talked about the history. And 2 weeks later, a contribution came from them with a very nice note to the tent. This was before it was done. So maybe we touched that one family.
Well, you certainly
I hope
touched
so.
us. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us. I'm Hal Rhodes. Good night. Something we did not talk about in the program, but should have, is the ceiling. What's happening up there?
Well, it's simpler than the walls. In New York, when I was giving a tour of the ceiling, I said to the tour, well, it's quite whimsical, and one of the lights fell down. So I think I'll be more serious. It has the zodiacs of each of the three traditions over their walls, and the entrance to the tent on the ceiling is the angel Gabriel, who is shared by the three traditions, protecting the tent. At the four corners is the wind, blowing, creating the energy in the tent. And right in the center are angels that are looking down through a hole in the sky. So symbolically, what I tried to do is I tried to create a feeling of openness, so that one felt when that pole was going up, that it was going up further and further and further.
That must have been a lot of fun deciding
Yes.
what to do with all that.
Oh, I loved it. I loved it. It was wonderful. And then there's all sorts of little people and animals in the clouds, if you look carefully. Yes, yes, that was fun for me. It reminds me of the Persian miniatures in the mountains, if you look carefully.